now, though, let's tell you about developing nations. They say they expect the world's largest producers to commit more funding for climate change and a financing mechanism to assist them in dealing with natural disasters when they meet in November at the COP27 climate summit. The U.S.'s special envoy for climate change, John Kerry, says progress in completing a 150 billion rand financing deal is dependent on President Cyril Ramaphosa. We're joined now to unpack this further by Dr. Jason Musyoka, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Frontline Group. Thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. What do we need to understand about this, especially these financing packages towards the continent? Why the focus on South Africa? Is it Egypt that is also quite a big contributor to emissions on the continent?
Yes, Judy, thank you so much for having me. So I think the context of all of this is, of course, emerging from 2015, the Paris Agreement, and that has run its course all the way to now COP27, which we anticipate that there will be some outcomes or discussions happening in November. But to retract a little bit from there is to perhaps point out the fact that the commitments made by all the countries that signed the Paris Agreement, which includes South Africa, included assisting developing nations so that they are able to make their transition to low carbon power or to decarbonize their economies. South Africa was particularly singled out because it's one of the top 10 producers of coal and actually produces thermal coal, which is, wet coal, which is really kind of dirty, and it is more carbon heavy compared to other kinds of coal. So South Africa is one, Namibia is another, Angola is another, Egypt is also another. So all of these key economies, they are at the core of the discussion of how to move from high carbon economies to low carbon economies. So the commitment, the financial commitment that was made particularly towards South Africa was to assist with the so-called just transition, to make sure that there is a smooth landing and that the economy is not destabilized in the process of switching from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, or even to decarbonize altogether. So that being said, those commitments have not really been met. We've seen that the Minister of International Relations pushing back and suggesting that there need to be fast tracking of those commitments, but at the same time looking at different ways of funding rather than the loans which are being provided to countries like South Africa.
On that point, right, and especially you mentioned making sure that the economy is not destabilized from these switches, especially to the just energy transitions as well. What kind of support is appropriate for the continent? So we're sitting with donor or creditor countries. Will we then be able in the long term to sustain this or afford this?
So South Africa has been on the forefront pushing back against the proposition that it needs to decarbonize quickly, and the argument made has been that developed countries themselves, countries such as Germany or even the US themselves, they developed through a long process of making use of their natural resources. So for South Africa, the question is more perhaps complex. It is not very clear how and what, which is why there are teething problems on how the kinds of support that should be given to these countries as they transition. But that being said, I think it's important also to note that it is possible to harness less carbon power, such as solar in South Africa. I think we've fallen behind. And even now, as we face challenges with power across the country, I think that those are perhaps opportunities to begin to move away from coal. But I think that the kind of support that could be given could be perhaps bundling these kinds of power sources, and along the way we begin to move away from reliance on coal. But again, it's a complex question because most countries developed making use of their natural resources, and South Africa has been pushing to be allowed to make use of carbon generated power, coal plants, for it to move its economy from where we are to a much more developed one, and then we begin to make transition.
Well, we appreciate that the continent is not an island. Of course, we are living in 2022. So on the question of what kind of support is appropriate for the continent, are we speaking in silos, or can we possibly find a situation where the solution comes from within the continent, right? And we find ways of working with each other. Ultimately, we are the least contributors to emissions.
Yes, I think we live in a highly globalized world, and particularly in our continent now, since 2018, we've got the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I think with that it is very critical for South Africa to work with most of the other economies in the continent. It is still a tricky situation because South Africa exports 90% of the coal that is consumed around the continent is exported by South Africa or from South Africa. So South Africa is still a major player when it comes to how the discussions go. But that being said, it is very critical to ensure that there is a collaboration on how these discussions move forward. And South Africa has been very vocal on a global scale and on a continental level as well. Perhaps the power asymmetry that exists at the moment, which to be quite frank, might be a bit hypocritical, because what we've seen in particularly Russia, the declining of supply of gas and coal from Russia to the rest of Europe has actually forced Europe to go back to the use of coal. And that really might show some hypocritism of the pressure on countries that have got almost no other options. They have to rely on coal, and yet when the times are really tough, then the region that has been championing the use of or decarbonization has retreated back to carbon-heavy economies. So it's a tricky situation still, but I suppose we might hopefully move the discussion forward in COP27.
Sure. And Doc, maybe I ask of intercontinental integration or collaboration maybe being the word, because we also are made to understand that some of the conflict that we are seeing in some parts of the continent is because of climate change, right? So how do we then understand that element or that factor when it comes to these conversations that are being held with countries who are outside of the continent?
So Africa's integration has been a little bit slow compared to most other regions. And even then, you have various blocks. You have the SADC region, you have East African region, which is partly your IGAD region, you've got ECOWAS region. Each one of them are in different levels of integration. And I think that there is anticipation that the AFCFTA, which unfortunately was slowed down by COVID-19, it might create more integration. And I think that integration could bring discussions that are very critical, like climate change, to the table, and we have a continental propositions and discussions. We've seen most of the climate change conferences where Africa is present that Africa doesn't really have much to offer in terms of solutions. It is rather requiring or asking for aid. So there are more African countries more asking than providing solutions. And I hope that that can change, particularly when we begin to forge our own path forward economically on a continental level. So countries are not operating on their own.
Can't afford for that not to change. Thank you very much, Dr. Jason Musyoka, CEO of the Frontline Group.